Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just give everyone a few minutes to join. I see some numbers coming in. It's great to see everyone this afternoon. And just so that you know that you're in the right place, this is the Keeping Forest webinar on markets momentum and the decade ahead. My name is Laura Calandrella. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the executive director of Keeping Forest. And just so you do know, this meeting is being recorded. We will be sending out a link to it after today is completed, so probably next week sometime. And as you're joining, I do want to just orient you to a little bit of the Zoom functionality for those of you who are not familiar with Zoom. So we do have the chat box open today, and I would really encourage you, if you want to interact with one another, that's what that is there for. I do have somebody monitoring it for me, but I won't be actively monitoring it. If you do have questions and answers at the bottom of the screen, if you do have questions that you would like answered, at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A box, and that you can put those in there. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the session. Those I will be monitoring, so I'll take a look at those throughout the session. But otherwise, we have a pretty packed agenda today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Laura Calandrella. I'm the executive director of Keeping Forest, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. I've been preparing for it, it feels like for forever, and really trying to decide what's the frame that would be best or that would best serve our community at this moment in time. And so, what today is and what it isn't. So, we aren't going to talk a lot today about Keeping Forests programs or an update on the work that we're doing. We just celebrated, or we're about to celebrate, our 10-year anniversary. So, a conversation that was convened by the U.S. Endowment and the U.S. Forest Service in 2016, in May of 2016, asked the question, how do we ensure a future for the 245 million acres of forest in the U.S. South? And out of that grew what is now Keeping Forest. And so there's big celebration there to have 10 years under our belt, 10 years of learning. And while we do have a lot of lessons learned to share and we do have program updates, that is definitely what today is not about. Instead, what I'd like to do is take a broader perspective about hey, Danan,
Hi.
about where we are at this moment in time. So we are all very much focused on markets, and that is something that has come into full force over the last year. And this is something that Keeping Forest has been focused on really in our evolution over time. So we've been thinking a lot about markets and markets in the South. And so I'd like to take today to take a step back and really share what we see going on right now in the Southern forest economy and the Southern forest landscape, and then what that means for the decade ahead. So we will have, as I mentioned, we will have time for Q&A. We do have a couple of speakers today that I would like to introduce. And one of them just popped on. And so you'll hear from him a little bit later. So Danan Margason is the CEO and co-founder of Arden AI. And Arden is a platform helping institutional landowners evaluate opportunities across timber, agriculture, energy, data centers, and conservation. He's held senior product roles at Carbon Direct and Booking.com, began his career as a venture and real estate attorney, and even competed as a U.S. national team rower. Also, we have Tracey Sutherland from Stein joining us today, Associate Director of Strategy at Stein, which is a business-to-business ad firm. So Tracey has more than 20 years in marketing and advertising across B2B or business-to-business strategy, brand, and demand. She's worked across sectors like technology, telecom, sustainability, and the public sector, and loves wandering museums and discovering new stories and old masterpieces. So we'll hear a little bit from her later, and they're going to help frame this conversation today. But to just jump in, I think we all have different reasons for being here today. And again, if you want to take time to engage with one another in the chat, I will look at that later. Love to see, what is your reason for being here today? But in general, I think that we are all experiencing very similar kinds of things right now. So we're experiencing market dynamics, particularly in the South, just the loss of mills, the mill closures over the past year have been increasing and at a pace that really is astounding in a lot of ways and having a ripple effect throughout our forest economy and just rural economies as well. Loss of traditional markets for low value wood, and we especially are seeing that after storm events. What do we do, in combination with mill closures, and then just shifting buyer demand. So those market dynamics are one thing that I'm sure is bringing you here today. We're also seeing a lot of institutional strain. So just last week, many of you probably saw that the Forest Service announced its reorganization, which will really change the way that we think about regional coordination across the Southeast, but just in general, not just in the public sector. We're seeing a lot of reduced capacity within organizations and businesses. There's a lot of funding uncertainty. And again, not just from the public sector, we're seeing a lot of hesitancy in the private sector as well. Shifting mandates. I mean, again, markets are something that Keeping Forest has been focused on for quite a while, but it really has come into more of the mainstream of the conservation conversation in the last year. And again, just public sector reorganization. And then lastly, what we're seeing is land use competition. So just this accelerated demand for development. And Danan's going to talk a little bit more about that when we bring him on later. But it's not just development in the traditional ways that we've seen it in the South. The South remains the fastest growing region of the country, but we're seeing data centers, we're seeing projected energy use, and this is the place where the land base is. So some of those are higher value uses that then are putting pressure on forests for conversion even more. And so it's not just these individual dynamics or these individual things that are bringing us here today. These things are happening simultaneously and at a really unprecedented pace. So when we think about that, what I would like to posit is that we're in a new Southern forest market era. And I think the good news about that, though, is that markets for Southern forests are not fixed. I think there's a tendency to, when we're in high periods of uncertainty, to really believe that we have to be reactive to the circumstances in front of us, and that we have no control over the dynamics that are at play. And I'm here to tell you today, or I'm here to posit today that we actually do. And so what we're experiencing right now versus what could be. So what I'm seeing is these fragmented market signals. So new uses from emerging markets coming online, new products coming online that come from forest products. But all of the market signals, like what is the value of forest? That's not always clear in the marketplace. And so I think that we as a community have an opportunity to really shift those market signals to make forest value easy to recognize. Next, we're seeing that capital is really disconnected from long-term value. So when we think about forests and the value that forests provide, and we think about our current economic structure, the way that the way that we think about performance over quarters instead of over the life cycle of a forest or the regeneration cycle of a forest. We're not the current economic structure and the current economic frame really isn't valuing the generations of production that Southern forests have had and have the potential to have. And so what could be, there is an opportunity, I think, for us to really start to align the way that capital moves inside of this economic frame with stewardship and with resilience. And then also we're seeing limited institutional capacity to really we don't have the financial structures, the financial mechanisms, or really even the institutional understanding to be able to, let's say we're at a point of making a land deal that has to do with solar or data, or we're looking at emerging markets that have to do with carbon or biodiversity, or in our case, we're looking at watershed outcomes. We don't have these structures that are in place and the financial mechanisms for transferring capital into long-term forest management outcomes. And so we're in this kind of messy middle right now And so and as change is happening so quickly and accelerating so much, without those structures in place, land is at higher risk for conversion. But I do believe that there is an opportunity for us to have the platforms and to have intermediaries, intermediary organizations or intermediary kind of technologies that can help us to structure, aggregate, and deploy capital in a way that really does serve the future of Southern forests. So that is what is, that is what could be. And what if there's anything that I want you to take away? So if you only stay for the first 10 minutes of today's call, what I want you to take away today is that markets are shaped by what gets recognized, financed, and coordinated. So I'm just going to let that land. They're shaped by what gets recognized in the marketplace, what gets financed, and what gets coordinated. And so at each one of those stages, there are decisions that are being made, and there are actors that are making those decisions. We get to be part of that. We can influence how Southern forests are represented when and where those decisions get made. So what I hear right now a lot is the question of how do we create more markets for Southern forests? I think that's the wrong question. And I said that in one of my recent emails. I think that that is a question that addresses the symptom, not the structure that is underlying our forest economy and our Southern forest economy. Instead, what I think we need to be looking at and asking is what are the conditions that shape whether Southern forests remain a competitive land use? So conditions are different than symptoms, right? And to give a little bit of a primer today, I don't want to get to this is not a I promise that this won't be too theoretical today or too much of a lecture, but I do think there are three words that are really important to understand as we go through today's conversation, because I'm going to be using them over and over again. So signals. So when we think about signals, those are the things that we can visibly see happening in the marketplace right now. They are not symptoms, but they are directional cues. They are cues that tell us that something bigger is happening underneath. That is a condition that can be addressed. So the condition is the underlying factors that determine what the market recognizes and rewards. And then underneath all of that is the system, the dynamic interaction between the political, economic, and ecological forces that are creating those conditions. So keeping forests from our inception, really, we've always looked at how do we create change at the level of conditions. Because we know that as all of those dynamics I mentioned a few minutes ago, markets and institutional capacity and land use competition, that there's also the policies that are surrounding that. There's cultural values that are surrounding that. And all of that is shifting. It's constantly shifting. And so if we can start to look at what are the conditions that are creating that system and start to really create solutions at that level, then we have an opportunity to really, really make sure that there is a future for Southern forests. So just keep those three things in mind as we move forward. And if we only respond to signals or if we're only responding to the symptoms that we're seeing, we can make progress. But I think the call to action for all of us here today is to look a little bit deeper, because if we just address signals and symptoms and we don't address the conditions, we're missing an opportunity to ensure that the broader Southern forest landscape has an economic competition and is also ecologically resilient over time. So here's based on the last 10 years of our work and the interventions that we have been working on within the Southern forest landscape, there are three signals that I think are really important to pay attention to, that we're going to go through today, and we're going to look at what are the conditions that they're pointing to. So first is that Southern forests are valued as this interchangeable commodity. And what I mean by commodity is really just so I think about sort of parallel efforts in the United States, for example, with energy or with organic food, right? You can buy an apple that you buy from New Zealand is the same as the apple that you buy from New England, right? And unless there is some way to differentiate that. And right now, when we think about Southern forests, they tend to have, a commodity kind of pricing. So going back to the example of or organic food or of energy that we get from the Middle East versus energy that we get from here, is there a difference in where in how we choose one of those products? And there isn't a difference until we create that differential. So right now we have this huge scale of timber volume in the country. We have all of these different products that come from the South, but that isn't doing anything to affect the pricing of that. There isn't a regional identity that's seen in the marketplace. And so until you start to create that, like for example, going back to your apples with, an organic label, or going back to energy with some sort of renewable energy source that's from a geographic provenance. There isn't something that says I want to choose here. So southern forests are just competing as any other forest would in the world. And so what that's doing is that's flattening the value for some of the very innovative things that are coming out of our forests. So for example, that our forests are productive and can be a source for sustainable aviation fuel. There's no differentiation for that in the market. So the condition that we really need to be thinking about influencing when we're trying to address this signal and the condition underneath is that the market isn't adequately rewarding the landscape qualities that we have that make southern forests reliable, productive, and investable over time. So we have this amazing landscape, this connected landscape, and different than growing apples or than renewable energy. The products that come from southern forests absolutely depend on the relationship between the ecosystem. So although we have landowners that have parcels of land, connecting that parcel to a larger geography and a differentiated geography is something that we can start to influence so that we do reward the landscape qualities that are not only the product, like the timber or fiber that's coming from our lands, but also any of the ecosystem service benefits that we're seeing as well. So that's signal number one. Signal number two is that capital is available, but the forest economy cannot capture this. And this goes back to some of what I was saying earlier about the messy middle. So I just read a really interesting article from Quantified Ventures that was talking about the amount of earmarked dollars for nature-based solutions, and really showing that there is climate and resilience capital that's growing. But also in that particular post from Quantified Ventures, what they pointed to was this idea that that there isn't that what we're actually missing right now is the developers, the project developers. And project developers don't want to take the risk, the risk of developing for something that they're not sure will be invested in. And those with the capital to invest don't want to invest until there is a structure. So we have these earmarked dollars for nature-based solutions, but there's no structure to actually to capture it. When we think about some of the competing high land use values that are new coming online outside of sort of development, when we think about data centers, when we think about energy, these are high land use values. These are high value land uses, and they're happening at an extremely rapid pace. Because they're happening at that rapid of a pace, we aren't out in front of being able to think about how do we structure deals, or how do we be part of the conversation as data centers come in, or as new energy infrastructure comes online, to think about, okay, we might lose this piece of forest in this particular place, but can we also direct some of the capital that's going into the land investment into forest management at a broader scale, and at a sub-regional or even regional scale? And so what we're seeing through this signal is that because we don't have these structures, the market's just defaulting to the lowest friction transaction. And in some cases, there are structures. We do have structures for, we still have carbon credits, for example, and we do have biodiversity credits that are coming online, and we're working on some watershed outcomes, not credits, but just how do we start to finance around watershed outcomes. But without those strong structures in place, the market's going to default. So the condition that we need to influence here is this idea that the market lacks simple, proven, trusted ways to finance and carry forest values through transactions. So instead of me talking about this or continuing to talk about this, I'm actually going to bring Danan into the conversation. These are recorded interviews because I wanted to make sure that one, we had enough time for the conversation, but also to really make sure that the narrative today, that the arc of the story today made a lot of sense. Danan will be with us a little bit later for Q&A. So let's go ahead and see what Danan has to say. Well, it's great to have you here today, Danan. I just want to start off, if you would please just tell us a little bit about who you are and Arden and how you got into this field.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Laura, and really admire the organization and respect what you all are doing. So, Danan Margason, I grew up in a sort of forestry family. My grandparents were in the Forest Service, and my parents met in a small town called Quincy in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I went on to go to law school, and in the early parts of my career, did kind of a mix of real estate and venture capital work. Ended up joining a venture company when it was very early stages, and we grew, it was called Tune Marketing Technology, totally unrelated to forestry, but we grew that and sold it. I moved to Amsterdam and led product at booking.com, and at Booking got very involved with sustainability initiatives, including carbon credits. Ended up taking that experience and starting a carbon credits project called Carbon Direct. We worked with large landowners and large corporates on carbon credit procurement and development. So really got exposed to the forestry sector again through that work, and left last year to start Arden, which works primarily with large landowners, but can be any landowner who's looking to find other ways to monetize their land and also improve environmental outcomes for their land in a world where the forest sector is going through a unique period. Agriculture is also uncertain. And so how do we think about the future of land and monetization of land with all these dynamic changes in the world of AI and everything else? So that's what got me here.
It's very interesting, and I know that AI is on everybody's mind in so many different aspects of our life. And so I'm really glad you're here today because this is a unique application that I know a little bit later you'll talk about some of the positives and maybe some consequences that we might be facing. But I think it's a real opportunity for people to understand how AI can help landowners. And you're working, like you said, directly with landowners who are thinking about multiple potential uses for their land, but there's not often a clear way to assess the underlying value or even hidden value that they might not know about. So how does Arden and how does AI change their ability to understand what their land is actually worth?
Yeah, great question. That's really the core of art. And there's a couple of things that are happening with AI. So one is just the obvious thing, which is we're seeing data center build outs and growing energy needs. It's really unlike anything we've ever seen in history when it comes to electricity load growth. And so lots of solar, lots of wind, which will come back, lots of other ways of developing power like geothermal, nuclears is being discussed, and then of course the actual build outs of data centers and the things that come along with that, which can also often be other economic growth along housing and things of that nature. So land is changing very dynamically, probably more so than at any point in U.S. history over the next 20 years. And so that's really interesting macro environment that's happening. And then in terms of the actual technology and what we can do with it for landowners, if you historically look at how we value land, it was very localized, very comparable based on nearby sales. We now have attributes across every parcel in the US. Arden is doing this. They exist in other platforms as well. And AI can look at all of that in one analysis and look at what are the core characteristics of this land and how could it be used and how do we value it on a macro scale. And that's never been possible before. You talk to independent valuators, a profession we really respect, but they're generally going to be in one vertical. So how do we think of this from a forestry perspective, from a housing perspective? AI is able to look across multiple verticals. We're covering 8 or 10 at this point, and figure out highest and best use is one piece. How do you think about the value? And you can look at land that has similar characteristics across the country and how it's been trading, whether that's been going up or down. And then how do you compare these things? So even if you could have multiple uses, or even if your neighbor might also have the same potential, which one of you is more likely to get the attraction of a developer, and what are the environmental and economic consequences of that? So just the sheer scale of AI is unprecedented, and the amount of analysis we can do is really interesting.
Sounds like you're putting fair market value, but sort of a new definition of fair market value, like of all of the potential opportunities for the land.
Yeah, if you think about data centers, for example, they don't care where they are. They're doing training on models, and all they need is power and willing landowner and a willing community. And so generally power is the most solvable of those. So they're really looking broadly at where can we build and where do people see the opportunity in this from a tax perspective, from a job perspective, from a housing development perspective. So there is a lot of upside to data centers, and there's also potential downsides. And so communities are navigating that, but they, again, don't care where they are. So you're looking at what are the characteristics of this land and where could we do this? Similarly for solar, where, as long as you can connect to the grid, power moves at, or electricity moves at nearly the speed of light. It doesn't really matter where it is. So what are the core characteristics of that land that allows somebody to build? And of course, then you start to go into things like housing, which is much more localized, or even forestry, where mill locations and infrastructure matter a lot. And AI has done a really great job of thinking about these dynamics and really identifying core value based on what needs to be local, what's nationalized, what are the characteristics, all of that. So it's definitely a really interesting period.
Interesting. Yeah. And so when you actually are working a lot in the South, that's how we met. I met you here in Atlanta. So when a landowner is looking at the different options for their land, how does your work help them to compare those choices and make a decision?
Yeah, so the first and primary thing we do is we look at what could be done here. And often it's forestry is so clearly the core value driver, or agriculture. And so you don't want to go a whole lot beyond that, but you might start to look at how could we identify other types of partners for this forest land who might be more interested. So that could be a conservation group. It could also be a different relationship with a different forest management group. So there's ways to even extend beyond, or even look at just a single use, but where it gets really interesting is when you have the potential to do multiple uses, and that's also often the case. So housing comes up quite a bit in the South. You've got conservation, which I already mentioned, comes up quite a bit, and wildlife corridors and things of that nature. And then of course you have the sort of big upside ones in solar and data centers. And there's a long tail of other opportunities as well that we look at. And so once you've identified that you have a site that has potential to be something else, then it gets into how likely is this to actually get developed? Because there might be other sites in the area. And that's a really critical part of what we do, is figure out how a developer would prioritize this against other opportunities they might see. Because it's one thing to know that you could build solar here. It's another to know that it would be attractive and very likely to get developed. And then once you've done that analysis, you can start to go into how do we price this? And we look at pricing a couple different ways. One is comparable sales and trends, which I just mentioned, sort of the Zillow estimate. And in fact, co-founder Ben was one of about 24 people that's ever worked on this estimate team at Zillow. And then the other way we value it is looking at forward cash flows. So you can forward cash flow from a forestry perspective, which is typically how this land has been valued in the public markets. But you can also look at that from a solar perspective or a data center perspective and start to see where that delta is and how much negotiation leverage you might have when working with a developer.
So a lot of our landowners want to keep their forests as forests, and there's other economic plays. And so I want to make clear, because you and I've had extensive conversation about this, the way that your tool helps them to keep their forests as forests when they do have all of these options, right? That you're talking a lot about development, you're talking a lot about conversion to other uses. So how does it help them keep their forests as forests and see those choices clearly?
Yeah, it's a great question. Our whole team comes from climate and sustainability backgrounds. Our motivation in building Arden is to protect forest land, and but it's a complicated thing that's happening where we do have a lot of needs outside of just forestry. So we really approach this from a balanced perspective of how do we think about the right allocations to all of these different needs while preserving as much natural space as we can. And planning from that macro perspective is really important to us. But if you think about something like a data center, the amount of revenue that a firm can earn from a data center so outweighs forestry that they could feasibly protect 200,000, 300,000 acres of land for a single 500-acre data center development. So you want to start to look at these types of things. You also think about how a solar or data center site that's successful can fund jobs, can fund housing, can fund parks, can fund conservation. And so we want to look at that holistically, and that's really what it comes down to. At the end of the day, data centers are going to get built. They might get built in North Dakota, they might get built in Georgia, but they will get built. And so the unlock here is thinking through how can we leverage this opportunity to turn it into something that's useful for everyone and not always look at it as a net negative, because often these folks, and I know many of them, are very, very willing to work with communities and landowners, and they also probably care a lot about sustainability. And in fact, a lot of the at the hyperscalers, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Microsofts, many of the people who own the data center also own sustainability organizations. That's their background. And so we're trying to create that nexus point for landowners.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing to something that I'm the sort of the thesis of our entire call today, which is we have to be really active in shaping the market, right? It's either going to happen to us or we're going to help shape it, which I hear is
Yeah.
part of what Arden is doing and helping others to do. And so that leads me to the next question, which is we're kind of in this messy middle, right? There's this acceleration of disruption. Capital disruption. There's all these things that I feel like they're changing really, really rapidly. And so, even when we have better information and clearer value, that doesn't necessarily automatically translate. For example, building a data center doesn't automatically translate into investing in active forest management. You just gave a really good example of like what could be possible in terms of for X amount of acres, we could also have this many in active management or community centers or whatever it is. But so I want to get to the question of, okay, so AI can help us to understand value, but are markets really able to respond and direct investment into working for us? Does that structure exist there, or are there structural reasons that we're not keeping up?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And fundamentally, this comes down to how do you get deals done? And, our view on it and what we've seen in practice so far is folks who are involved in forest land and are leaned in and interested can get deals done and can be actually really helpful to all parts of the market. And so if you're clear on what your goals are, whether you want to drive financial outcomes for your investors or for your family, whether you want to make sure that you conserve a lot of wild spaces for your kids to experience, if you come and bring those perspectives to the table and also say, I recognize there's a lot of change happening and there will be housing built in this area. There will be solar and wind and data centers and, subsurface things that are happening. I want to find a path where this works for everyone. Generally, you can find that path, and that's really exciting and interesting for folks who are leaned in. Those who are sort of watching from the outside, it's harder because, again, these things will happen regardless. So you can either let it happen around you or you can participate. And I'll say that from a developer perspective, well, firstly, I'll say Arden's working on behalf of the landowners. We've been very clear on that, and that's kind of our core customer. So, but in order to serve our core customer, we do have relationships with developers. And from the developer perspective, they're very excited to work with landowners and communities who are eager to have them. That's the most important thing for them. And so those that come and say, hey, we're open to building a data center in our county or in our town, but we want these things. We want you to conserve this land. We want you to, to build this park or this school. Those conversations can happen and do happen, and in fact, they can be very positive. So that's sort of my general tone towards landowners is, take this opportunity for yourselves too. Don't just look at it through the media, but actually lean in and think about what you can offer.
Yeah. I was going to ask you a question around what would need to exist or change, but I think you've kind of already answered that. It's sort of a call to action to us, right? To Keeping Forests and to our partners to really be thinking about how do we want to actively shape this with the markets that are moving, right? With markets and development has always been the biggest threat to forests in the South. Not always, but in the last 20, 30 years has been the biggest threat to forests in the South. And so I think there's a more active role as we think about how do we engage, and there does need to be some sort of architecture around around Southern landowners that helps them to learn how to do that, or be advocates for themselves or have advocacy kinds of groups or pathways to go down. So, or frameworks. Um, so last
Yeah.
question. So go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say on that point, I'm our team is based in Seattle. I've worked in tech, and I think it's been really interesting to spend a lot of time in the Southeast because nature connects everyone in these worlds, politically and culturally, and from a working perspective. We all want to preserve open space. We all want to have places for our families to run around and to hunt and fish and hike and all these things. And so I've been really, really warmed by the kind of welcoming we've had coming as a tech company into the southeastern forest lands, and I wasn't sure what the reception would be. But we all clearly share this goal of preserving land for generations to come, and improving our environment and climate in the process. So I think that's a really interesting and unique thing just to point out, and sort of an opportunity in front of us.
Awesome. And I don't think you mentioned at the beginning when you were introducing yourself that you are a Forest Service legacy child.
Yeah, no, my grandparents, yeah, met in a small or lived in a small forest town that's brought them to the U.S. My parents are living there again now, so yeah, I spent a lot of time. My grandma's house was across from a mill, so I would spend my childhood in the summers just watching timber get produced. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. See, welcome home then. Okay, so last question. What do you think people most underestimate about what's going on right now and for how decisions get made?
I think people may be generally aware, but have no idea the pace at which change is happening, and also just how many industries and types of roles it's going to impact. So that's the scary part is we are going through a dramatic shift in our economy. It's important to pay attention and to lean in and not be fearful because another thing people may not recognize is how much control we have over these systems and where it will take us. And the people who are learning how to use AI and leverage it are becoming incredibly powerful in their jobs, and are able to do and leverage themselves in ways they never have before. So that's exciting, but it also is a scary period because a lot of jobs and ways of doing things will be impacted. The other thing that I think people maybe not don't appreciate is just the electricity needs and the infrastructure needs that come along with this moment. And this will be the core focus of a lot of capital in the US over the next 20, 30 years is how do we just build a lot more inside of the country? And that, goes to commercial and industrial, all the way up to data centers and electricity and grid developments. So again, a really unique opportunity to be a landowner because all of the stuff needs land to be built. And definitely a lot of financial opportunities for folks. But I think alongside that is this environmental opportunity too. And so getting these folks to talk and work together is really, really important. And, the core of what I know Laura is doing and what we're doing. So we're excited to keep this partnership.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really glad that we have smart people that decided to come back into forestry from big beginnings that started outside of forestry, because I do think, your understanding not only of the tech world and of artificial intelligence, but also just your ability to see sort of the macroeconomics at play, but also having a connection to the landowner. All of those things are so important to be really guiding us in the right direction as we all catch up to the pace of change. So thank you for sharing your perspective and time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for all the work you do.
Great. Well, so I just listening to that to that again, Dana, I just am really glad that the work that you're doing. I think I want to underscore some points. I mean, he talked about the pace of change, but I think there's a lot of good news in what Dana just shared with us, and I want to underscore too that the market is already being shaped by actors who are organized, ready, and ready to negotiate outcomes. And so I think we have more agency than maybe we realize. And Dana, I do see you popped on. I think we're gonna hold questions until the end. But you can see,
Yes.
did you want to comment
No, no,
anything
no.
before we moved on?
I wasn't sure. I thought it might be
Yeah.
leading into questions. So I'll pause. Yeah.
I've confused you enough by by this point. But again, I really appreciate the way that you're pointing out the speed of change, the agency that we have, and but those two things are walking hand in hand, right? Things are happening quickly, so we need to be well organized enough to actually assume that agency and be in conversation and with as deals are getting done, as development is happening to and be thinking about the long-term ecological health of the region as well. But we definitely will come. I did see a question pop in the Q&A. I'm glad that that's working because there was
Well,
somebody
it's
asked
great
me
to have you.
if somebody asked me if it was, and I was hoping that it did. So Taylor, thank you for your question. We'll make sure to circle back around to that. But last signal that I want to hit on, and one more speaker there, and I think too, Danon mentioned throughout his talk, I think he was really specifically talking about not only the signal that is about capital, but also about how do we value Southern Forest in many different ways. I mean, and he's built a company around it. So I think we're starting to see that there are opportunities and there are pathways and there are companies and people and leaders out there that are doing this and can be points of intersection for us. But lastly, our market narrative is not built for B2B decision making. And keeping forest really, as we've gone through our work and understood that the highest points of leverage right now, we do believe are going to come from corporate investment. And particularly over the last year, it's not with public sector shifts and how that's even impacting, traditional conservation grants that we're seeing. We really do need to be thinking about how we're interacting with corporates. And once Keeping Forest got its NGO status, I ended up on a whole bunch of new NGO newsletter lists. And even the way that philanthropic dollars are looking, one, that they're looking at funding things that are addressing systems level issues, but then also just looking for opportunities to invest in systems level issues and not necessarily programs and projects. And so they're looking for that interaction between public-private partnerships and NGO, public government, and private sector. So we really do need to be thinking about how we are talking to the private sector. And I'm not talking about forest industry, but those outside of forest industry. Right now, because we have so many things that our forests provide, not just physical products, but the services that they provide, spaces for renewal and retreat. We can talk about all of the biodiversity and habitat, endangered species, right? Water quality, air quality. There's so many things that our forests provide, and that is why we need to keep our working forests as working forests. But when we're framing that to businesses and we're staying each in our own individual lanes with our messages, that's too many forest values, too many forest benefits that are competing for attention all at once. So we're sending these really complex and fragmented messages about and we have to remember too that a lot of people don't live in the world of conservation or understand ecological systems. So being able to communicate clearly and not have this fragmented message is going to be really important for us. But that's what we're doing right now. And what that does is that leaves buyers or investors to try to make an interpretation about why this is good for business. So I think there's sort of two layers here in the signal. It's that one, if we are communicating, even if we're communicating, here's the business case for biodiversity, or here's the business case for water, or here's a business case for active forest management for X, Y, or Z product. That's a lot of different narratives. That's a lot of different messages. And so when we think about the region as a whole and going back to signal number one, and how do we start to differentiate the region as a whole, there isn't an overarching message. And we're still competing with, biodiversity in any other part of the world, or water with any other part of the world. And so to really make a case for businesses, we need to start thinking about how they're thinking and what challenges they're trying to solve, and come at that particular business case with the multitude of solutions that we know that forests have. So I am going to bring on Tracey with Stein to talk a little bit more about that.
Tracey, it's great to have you here today. I would love to start off just by you providing a little bit of an introduction of yourself and of the work that you do at Stein and actually of Stein as well. So welcome and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. I'm happy to be here. So, my name is Tracey Sutherland. I am in advertising and marketing. I have been for over 20 years now, mainly working within the B2B landscape, but also I've worked on a lot of B2C as well, even some healthcare and nonprofits. So, my background really ranges from like anywhere from branding all the way through sales enablement, so the full funnel of brand to demand, which is one of the reasons why I love working at my current position at Stein, because Stein really is an advertising agency that does focus on that full funnel. So developing a brand all the way through creating that value in the market and eventually revenue for the company. So that's my background, and I'm super happy to be here today to share some of that experience with you in more of a nonprofit type of setting and for forest in general.
Yeah.
So excited.
Great. Yeah. And you've been working with Keeping Forest a little bit for the
Mhm.
last four months or so. And
Yep.
I've just been really impressed with the work that Stein has done in relatively short order to create a messaging framework around Southern Forest. You're also a Texan. So
I
I think
am.
this has has hit a little bit close to home for you. So we're always appreciative to have another Southerner in our
Yes.
midst. And it's important it was important to me to have you as part of this conversation today to really start to reframe this idea of storytelling and people understanding our story or understanding forests into a frame that really is about business decisions and shifting the market. So, and
Yep.
not just general public, right? But or in consumers, but really within Keeping Forest, what we're wanting to do is change the way that businesses, which Stein is a B2B agency,
Mhm.
make decisions about, how they're understanding forests and how they're valuing forests. So in a business context, how does narrative shape what companies actually choose to prioritize, buy, or invest in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the biggest difference when it comes to business is that companies really aren't making decisions in silos, right? They're not making business decisions individually. They're really making these decisions as a group. And so, and within a business that can range from, procurement to sustainability to finance to operations. And each of those, have different priorities. And, each of them have different pressures that they feel within their positions. And so, what narrative does is really give that buying group a shared language that they can use to not only align, but also to justify any decisions that they make internally. So, for example, it's not so much about telling a better story. It's really about making choices that each of the players involved can defend, right? A CFO needs to defend a certain thing. You need to defend a certain thing to a board, or even like if you need a sustainability report, you need to, defend what you put in that sustainability report. And so, when it comes to Southern Forest, and having had the privilege to work with you guys for over 4 months now, I think there is a real opportunity here for Southern Forest to take the fragmentation that maybe you're seeing in the landscape and within the industry and, really explain, why this region and why now and to really have that be the role of the narrative, is to really bridge the gap between what companies say they value, say, for example, like sustainability, and what they're actually willing to procure at scale, right? And so there's really, not only does that need to happen when a story is the conduit to make decisions easier and easier to defend, but also to get everyone in alignment under the same narrative and what you're marching towards. And then that way you can have that narrative shape the whole industry rather than just like components of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also what I hear in what you're
Mhm.
saying when you talk about procurement or you talk about finance or operations or
Mhm.
sustainability, I think we have a tendency within our industry to go at people with like, look how cool forests are, and these are all of
Yeah.
the things that are important to us that we really value, and they are cool. And even individuals within a business might think that those are cool as well. But as far as decisions being made, it really does come down to an actual business decision and what the individual agenda is of any particular department within a business. That's what I'm really hearing too from you, not just today, but in our work together of what
Mhm.
do they value? We've talked in the webinar today about forest being a commodity and what needs to shift there. But that word interchangeable, like a forest is a forest, is kind of where we're at. And we have multiple actors within the South, let's just say. We have
Mhm.
multiple actors, whether it's a conservation NGO or somebody in forest industry or government or
Exactly.
keeping forest. We're all telling different stories about the same thing,
Mhm.
and in this case, forest. So, what impact does that have then on how businesses perceive, in this case, a commodity, and then act on
Yeah.
choosing it or purchasing it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, when it really comes down to it, I think, to your point, I think multiple actors do tell different versions of that story, and, the market doesn't piece it together, right? And so, there is, this whole idea of having this kind of coherent idea that's out in the market when there are several different players telling different stories, it's like that has a big impact on how businesses perceive and act on things, right? And so, for example, we're seeing right now that, and these are just examples off the top of my head, but like fiber being sold in one way, or carbon being talked about in another way, or, biodiversity, there's a narrative going on over here about it, or water, there's another one. And while each of these are valid, I think in isolation, they compete for attention, right? Rather than really reinforcing one another. And so I think, when it comes to Southern Forest, instead of seeing it as a system, a lot of people out in the market see it as just a different menu of options, right? And really you know, having that bigger issue that really looks at that fragmentation and really it starts to either feel confusing or kind of overclaimed. Whereas in a B2B environment, confusion doesn't create that curiosity, right? It creates that hesitation. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think, in this example, with Southern Forest, it's really key to create that alignment around a single directional idea.
Yeah. So where do you think we have the greatest potential to be seen differently and valued differently as a region?
As the first thing that comes to my head is that Southern Forest is a system that has worked reliably over time, and I think I think that's really an attribution to lead with and to really put like stake your claim in, because it really has, it's a high performing working forest system that really does deliver multiple values, multiple forms of values over time and over generations. And it's been legacy in the South. Like you said, I did grow up in Texas and have been around a lot of landowners, and it really is that, I think, is what differentiates, is that it's it's a working ecosystem, a working, forest economy that has really proven over time that it has worked over and over and over again through generations, and also kind of contrast to being from the South. I lived in the West for a long time, in Utah in particular, and I know that their forest systems are breaking down, and I've seen a lot of the contrast, right? Because they haven't been managed in the way that southern forests have been managed. They haven't been cared for and regenerative and thought of in that system type of thought. And so we're seeing how their forests are, a lot of them are being destroyed by wildfires, unfortunately, but they're not managed the way they are in the South, so they're going away. And so
Right.
I think it's a real big differentiator that you have within the southern regions.
Yeah. I mean, and the interesting thing too is it's not just these single parcels of land, although we do have individual landowners. What
Right.
has made them work as a system and has kept working for us working is actually the entire range of the South. And even though landowners are concerned about their own land, when we think about the benefits that the South can provide, it really depends on that connected ecosystem. So with all of those attributes and all of those circumstances at play, how do you make sure that differentiation is grounded in what businesses actually need, so that it influences real decisions?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And I think, that last part to your question is key, influences real decisions, because when we do think about, differentiation, it has to map back up to a business problem. If it doesn't, then we're really not really getting to the root of what we're trying to solve for the audience, right? And so the bridge, I think, here is really understanding that businesses have, you know, distinct moments, distinct players within their ecosystem that need to differentiate in different ways, right? Or solve a different problem. And so when it comes to really choosing those differentiators, there needs to be an overarching one that really does allow other people to ladder up to. So, say, for example, with Southern Forest, it is about the region, it is about the system that has been there for, generations and decades. And to me, that's a huge differentiator for that region itself. And so, when it comes to the different players, within that ecosystem, well, the sourcing person, that's a differentiator when it comes to the region. For a sustainability report, that's a different proof point that you can bring in from that region. Or for a stakeholder, you can say, over time, this area, this region has brought in the X amount of value and so on. And so that overarching differentiator is about the region and of Southern Forest in general that everything else can ladder back up to. So I hope that made sense.
Yeah.
I think what I'm just trying to get across is that you really do need to translate the forest system kind of attributes into business risk language, right? So whatever the forest is bringing to these different stakeholders is really going to help them solve the problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah. And thank you for that. What I love about it is that if we look at southern forests and the geography and the ecosystem as the differentiator,
Mhm.
as needs change over time, as businesses evolve and
Exactly.
need different things, there's the many things that we have underneath it we still can pull from. So it's not to supersede any individual message about a specific product or a
Right.
specific forest value. It's about giving the region this full umbrella to be able to sell whatever is needed at the moment that it's needed to solve a business problem, Again, I think I said earlier, just knowing that all of those things are happening in the background. So
Yeah,
thank you for
definitely.
that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a great ecosystem, that Southern Forest has, because all these different players benefit from it, and I think having that cohesive narrative, and that one, unifying differentiator for Southern Forest as a region is super key in helping everyone else create value, right? So.
Great. Well, Tracey, thank you so much for your Tracey, it's great to have.
Oops, I cut that off. I was trying to close the Q&A box and accidentally cut the end off. So I'll just say it again. Tracey's on the line now. So Tracey, thank you again for your time, and I'm excited to share some of the work that you and your team are doing with Keeping Forest right now with the broader partnership here, hopefully pretty soon. And I hope what you heard in Tracey's message is that there really is a difference between a good message. We tell a lot of good messages and we have a lot of good stories, but there's a difference between a good message and a usable proposition, a usable business case, a usable value or market proposition. And so, you know, as we think about how these signals, how we start to address not the signals but the conditions underneath, I think at first it we really need to understand what's going on here, right? What are we trying to shift? So the signal one, if the landscape value is not rewarded, we really need to be thinking about demand. That's a demand condition. So our southern forests we're choosing. Are we making them we're choosing? And Tracey offered some insight into some of those attributes that might make southern forests we're choosing. Um, you know, we have these weak forest investment structures, although Danan is showing us through Arden just that there are credible investment pathways that he's working with landowners and investors to demonstrate those. So it's really addressing the issue of how do we move capital into simple, credible investment pathways that are well understood by both whoever is doing the development, the landowner, and the buyer as well. And then lastly, making taking these business these narratives that are fragmented and making them business relevant. So the condition there is there some sort of shared narrative that we can create a value proposition so that the market can actually act on it. So I'm saying this, I'm saying we, I'm saying conditions, I'm saying system, and I think before I answer a question that's in the chat box specific or in the Q&A specifically for me, I think what I want to emphasize is that these conditions do not move independently. We can't just work on one without pulling another thread. So demand shapes what the market recognizes and rewards. Capital shapes what becomes visible and scalable on the ground, and narrative shapes what buyers and investors see as important. And so if any one of those are weak, it's going to be harder to shift the others. We have to move them together. So going back to the very beginning of our time together, I said when we were asking the question, how do we create more markets? It's not that it's a wrong question. I think if I said that it was a wrong question, it's not a wrong question. It's an important question. It's a question we need to be asking, and we still need to be looking for different kinds of market opportunities. But what I'm pointing to, and what I hope Danan and Tracey helped to reveal as well, is that there's these three conditions that are underneath all of that that can actually get us to market opportunities that are good for the South as a whole, good for working forests, good for active management, and are considering these three conditions as interoperable. So there's a question in the chat box, and it's from Joe. So Joe, I'm gonna if this next section doesn't answer it for you, then I'll find a way to answer it more directly. But Joe asked the question for someone trying to connect industry with with research institution resources in a practical way. What does committed collaborator look like after this session? So this isn't a direct answer, but I'm part of why I just spent the last hour making the case for that we should be paying attention to signals and the conditions in order to shift the system is because I think that we do need a regional approach. And one of my noticings as there has been more interest over the last year, or heightened interest over the last year in markets, is that it feels like we're all scrambling. And that's natural, right? We all have our own missions that we are focused on. We all have our own stakeholders that we have responsibility to. We're all sort of subject to the same kind of funding fluctuations. And so, but there's also just this cycle that we're in right now, as well as a structural shift that's happening that has us kind of running in a lot of different directions. And I am at a point with Keeping Forest where I'm asking the question, is there still an interest in a regional approach? And I believe that there is a need for a regional approach. And here's why. Because when we just respond to the symptoms, to the idea of what's the forest market, what's the market that's going to solve working forest issues in the Southeast, that defaults us back to individual projects, individual programs, individual, grant applications, individual investments or partner relationships, and that can make a difference, but it's fragmented still, and it gives us isolated wins. If we just respond to the signals, then we have a little bit better pattern recognition, and but it's still not creating the alignment that is created when you actually start to respond to the conditions. And I think for all of us, hopefully these forests will outlast us for multiple generations. And what we're trying to do is set up the conditions that no matter what signals or what symptoms arise, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, that the system itself and the conditions that are enabling southern forests to exist into the future are really being tended to. So so in part, Joe, to answer your question is I don't know, because I think that there's still a lot to be answered. Where Keeping Forest has been operating, you hear me, if you've been on any of our webinars before, or you're familiar with our work, we talk about strategies. And I think I'm starting to actually shift that language, because these that are what I've called strategies in the past. These are all interrelated, and they're all pointing toward addressing those interconnected conditions, the way that those interconnected conditions affect the system. So, and as we have learned more and more, it's like I could almost see all three of these, what have been strategies, merging into one. But right now, how we've separated them out, when we're looking at the demand condition, what we're focused on there is creating a regional brand, and brand standards that help to create a whole identity for Southern Forest that encompasses all of those great values, all of the things that you all are working for individually within your organizations and in partnership with others, maybe in subregions across the region, but really trying to find that, what are the standards, what do we stand for, and what's the promise that we can make to the market in order to create that demand, to differentiate ourselves from any other forest region in the world. We're also looking at capital, and that's our work that we've been doing around, can we figure out a way for corporations to invest meaningfully in active forest management around watershed outcomes, and a lot of this, as we're moving forward, is to look at what are the deal structures, what are the transaction structures, what are the actual the platforms that need to exist, and how do we integrate things that are already accepted. So whether that's, certification standards like FSC or SFI, whether that's, BMPs or other things that corporations are already looking towards, we're trying to understand and create the framework that they can be replicated and scaled. And then lastly, our champions and leaders work. It's interesting. I think that's actually shifting, because I think the narrative piece underpins both demand and capital. And so moving forward, really looking at who are the buyers or investors, either on the demand or capital side, and what are the challenges that we need that Forest can solve for them. What are their business challenges, their business needs, and where does Southern Forest as a system fit into solving those? So that's how we've been working. But I think this is the moment right now, and I've mentioned a couple of times already, Keeping Forest did get its 501(c)(3) status or nonprofit status last year, and that's created some questions around our organizational structure, what role are we playing? Especially again, the Forest Service and the endowment were really who got keeping forests off the ground, and their roles are shifting and changing. But we have traditionally sort of held this frame for the region for working forests, and whether it's keeping forests, some other entity, some set of entities. I think there's this that as we're going about our individual missions, trying to understand where we need to partner, I would really like to start to ask the question, what is the need for a regional approach to a Southern forest economy? Do we still see that as the need? I think we need to have some really honest conversations around, the financial, institutional, operational backing that requires. And how do we think about that together? And then really also understanding who's going to hold that frame for the region. I think we have lost a lot in the reorganization of the Forest Service. The Forest Service didn't necessarily, need to be holding the frame for the working forest, the Southern working forest economy. They serve that role, though, in a lot of ways. They serve that role as convener. They serve that role as champion. They took a lot of risk and investment, not just in keeping forests, but in other things across the South. That's not there anymore. So who holds that frame? And how will we as a community, if we believe somebody does need to hold the frame, how will that entity or that set of entities be resourced and legitimized and recognized? So I think these are questions that are really on my mind as we move forward with keeping forest work. They're also what we will be reaching out about. So you'll receive a request for information that will start to ask some of these questions, to put these questions in a different light and start to pull some information out of the community as a whole. We also anticipate having probably about 3 regional alignment sessions in person. These are sessions just to sit down and have this conversation. What does it look like? What does it need to look like? Who is it? Are the things that Keeping Forest have been working on, does that still feel value? If not, why not? What goes in its place? And then I would like to have some deeper pressure test some of these strategies. And this is more, again, this goes back to Keeping Forest work and where we are. But regardless of our work, what we're doing, I hope that today you're really starting to see the importance of us hanging together as a region, what we can do, and not in like this kumbaya, we can do more together than we can as individuals. Although I do believe that that's true, but I really think that this is about economy of scale and economy of influence right now, and really getting aligned around some of the things that are key to this region and getting ahead of the changes, the land use changes, the economic changes, the cultural changes that are coming, and be part of that conversation instead of just reacting to them on the back end. So that's where we're headed over the next little bit. And I really appreciate your time today for hanging with us for an hour and 15 minutes. We do have time for some questions, and I've seen some questions pop into the box. So I'm going to actually ask Tracey and Danan if they'd like to join us. I'm going to stop sharing my video. So if you want to flip your cameras on and your mics on, and we have Daniel McInnes from the Forest Service too. I asked him if he would join us just to keep me on track. So you see him as a presenter as well. Daniel, you're welcome to say hello if you'd like to the group as well. So thank you, Danan and Tracey. And I want to open it up to the floor for you to say anything that you might have as a reflection after the last hour and 15 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&As. Is there anything that really stood out to you, or thoughts that you're left with as you're... Oh, there's Daniel.
I think, Laura, the way that you're looking at the market and understanding the opportunity today feels right and aligned with sort of the outside research we've done. We're new to the forestry space, started working directly in it only a year ago, but feels, like you're very prescient, like you're seeing it in exactly the way that, we see it and sort of the macro environment sees it. So excited to see what take the organization.
Great. Thank you. And Tracey also has joined us. Tracey, just I think I would just emphasize, what you said. I thank you for seeing the unique attributes that are in the South, and that they're not just something to feel good about, but actually do have a business proposition or a potential for a business proposition.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd love to answer this question that's in the chat right now around what conditions allow for our Southern brand to be accepted by those outside our people. I think that's a really great question. And, as Laura said, I'm from the South. I was just at my best friend's house near Austin, and we couldn't count how many times Texas was mounted around the property. And a Texas star. So I definitely understand like the South and but I think when it comes to Southern forests, acceptance doesn't necessarily come from explaining the South. I think it comes from making it legible and human and relevant to people who don't necessarily share that same experience, but really welcome other people into deeper conversations about it. So, maybe starting or leading with something that's more universal rather than just the entry point being Southernness. I think there has to be a human truth that everyone really recognizes, that everyone cares universally, that people can take pride in, a sense of belonging, a sense of stewardship. And so, I think the Southern identity of that becomes kind of the expression of that truth. But overarchingly, I think, it should be around working forest in general, right? And what that means to everyone.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on that just because we've done a little bit, Keeping Forest has done a little bit more thinking specifically. We don't want, and actually in work with Stein that we're doing, we talked a lot about like how much do we want to play up the South, and we don't want to fall into this like nostalgia trap, right? Or like our region is so great because it's the South. What we're starting to really focus on is what Tracey mentioned in her in her interview is the productivity of the land, the vastness, I think, of the land as well, the regeneration and stability over time, and also innovation. So we're really thinking about the geography as being highly productive, able to meet a multitude of benefits. The fact that it's privately owned and it's working land has its own set of benefits as well, and then the innovations that can come from that productivity is sort of where we're starting to focus there. So some of the attributes that that we're pulling out. And Danon, anything else that you want to say? You got to jump.
Yeah, I have to jump, but thanks so much for hosting. And
Thank you.
yeah, you're gonna share my contact info if anybody else
I
has.
will do that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right, so let's get to some of these questions in the chat. Where else should we be going and promoting forestry? What groups or meetings, places are we missing? What groups do we need invites to? Um, so I can answer that from my lens, and this is from Leslie Bobby. So Leslie, I'm thinking a lot about not being at forestry conferences this year. A lot of the questions I'm asking are about like who are those people that are investing in forest land? Are there conferences or ways to invite them into conversation? So I'm not saying I'm going to end up at an AI or a data conference, but if we're seeing a future where energy and data are really driving land use decisions, where are those people? Who are those people? How do we enter into conversations with them to just understand them first versus versus staying having these conversations the same conversations about land use change within our own forestry worlds. So that's that one. Let me just look at this really quickly. So there's another one about what specific ideas do people have for how conservation investments and forest product investments can help each other? I actually do want to answer this question because it's something that I wasn't able to slip into the frame of my presentation. There's a lot of thoughts going through my head, but I think one of the challenges, one of the points of tension that we're in right now is, and it goes back to this idea of commodity. Right now, we don't have a middle path for understanding investing or the value of forests. Traditionally, we have thought of it as, and I'm going to use a stronger word, we've thought of it as charity, right? So we forests are intrinsically good, so we should conserve them, right? Or we've thought of it as it produces something. So there's this extractive, there's this philanthropic lens, and there's this extractive lens. And I think this question is really getting at the idea of what's the in between, because and that is what we're exploring through each of our interventions. There we have to get out of this either or frame that it's either extractive or it's philanthropic, and really starting to be able to articulate those values for what they are. And there are intrinsic values, and that doesn't mean, so it's not that philanthropy goes away, it's not that commodities go away or their extraction goes away, but how do we start to frame those as two parts of something that's much bigger? And going back to something I said earlier about philanthropic dollars starting to shift toward systems level kinds of approaches. Seeing that when you just focus on, well, philanthropic dollars are just going towards traditional conservation projects, that it's not actually addressing the interplay of conservation with economics, policy, social issues necessarily. So I hope that kind of answers your question, or a lens of how I'm seeing it right now anyway. Um, so I'm just trying to see. So there's one, what do you see as the role of public forests other than simply keeping forests? Well, I'll answer that for the South. And I think I grew up in the West. So when I moved out to the Southeast over 20 years ago at this point, it was new to me to really understand the way that public and private lands interface. I was very used to that in I did a lot of work in developing countries prior to coming to the South. And so I was very used to that interaction of public and private lands. And so to see that in the South, and to see the interdependence of public lands and private lands, the interdependence of those partnerships, the way that we don't put a fence around our public lands, and so I think it will be interesting, Dan. Dan, you're the one that's asking this. I think it will be interesting to understand as the public sector, not just the Forest Service, but other agencies in the public sector start to shift their mandates or their focus or priorities a little bit. But I mean, and so I think I'm asking myself that question of where do those public sector partners that we've traditionally relied on or had specific relationships with, what does that look like now? And almost there may be some sort of role reversal here. And how is it these private lands and a regional approach to working forests and conservation through market-driven efforts, like what does that do for our public land? So I think there's a lot to be seen yet. What I know, though, is that in the South, in particular, our public and private lands rely on one another, and will continue to rely on one another. So, yet to be seen. This is one of those changes that's happening rapidly that we need to be thinking about and getting ahead of, so that we're not asking this question, 10, 20 years down the line when things have fundamentally shifted. Sorry, just reading some of these. So Chase Cook asked the question, for certification, SFI, FSC, briefly mentioned earlier, how, if at all, does it fit into the efforts discussed today and going forward? Put another way, would forest certification help to clarify for investors with understanding of what is? It doesn't sufficiently fit the problem as you see it. Um, it is confusing or not sufficient from from perspective of panelists, et cetera. So SFI and FSC and certification in general, or any other kinds of standards that we have out there, do a lot of work for us. And they're already accepted a lot, like in business communities, very, very much accepted and looked and sourced for, right? I mean, it doesn't go through your refrigerator, right? How many products in there are labeled FSC or your pantry? How many FSC or SFI? And so as Keeping Forest is thinking about it, both on the capital and the demand, like when we're thinking about the capital conditions and the demand conditions, we are absolutely thinking about what are the things that are already out there and accepted in the marketplace. So it on the demand side, as we're thinking about creating a regional identity, what can we say about Southern forests that is this proven through those standards of certification? Alternatively, when we're looking at how do we drive capital investments in new ways, one of the questions that we're asking is, what is it that corporations would invest in? We don't know. We're coming at it from this idea of, okay, we think that if we start to ground it into a watershed, and we're talking to corporations about watershed investments, then at least that puts them geographically somewhere on the ground. But then what else is there? Or what would they need to feel comfortable in investing? And certification may be one of those things. And so we're thinking a lot about, in that capital investment, if we can drive corporate dollars to active forest management and to specifically to landowners, is there somewhere in there that we also start to think about how do we increase the number? How does that corporate investment then help us to increase the number of acres that are in certification, whether it's FSC or SFI, or to really ensure that landowners are able to be competitive within the markets in the market space in the marketplace. So it's a great question, and it is very much front of mind and very much needs to be part of these conversations as we move forward. Um, Let me answer that one live. Sorry, I know this is weird because I'm just staring at at the screen, but I'm trying to read through them all. I used to have someone to like resolve these for me as I went through, but now I'm just sort of wading through. Are there active biodiversity projects and are biodiversity credits generating on U.S. forest land in the South? I know the answer to that is yes, but I don't have much more depth of knowledge beyond that. What I can tell you, just building on what I said about what outcomes within a specific watershed would corporations be interested in investing in. One of the things that we do know and that we're interested in having conversations with partners with is what are some of those other ecosystem services or benefits that people are already working on, because it may come to pass that that might be something that's more of interest. And I want to stay away from like traditional, I was about to say aggregation. I want to stay away from that language because that puts us very much in a carbon credit mind frame, and that's not really what we're going after here within Keeping Forest. Um, but we are thinking about, what are the multiple benefits, and how can we, back to Tracy, kind of what Tracy was saying, what's the business proposition? So what does the business actually need? And then we can also say, but there's also these other cool things that you can talk about, in your stakeholder report, in your annual report, right? So I don't know specifically, Jake, but I do know that they're going on, and we are having conversations with some partners about that. Um, okay, let me just go down. I think I've only got one question left. So I've always thought Keeping Forest should be a national movement, not solely a Southern initiative. Is that something that has been discussed by the Keeping Forest leadership? Yes and no. So we very much have a regional focus, and there's a reason for that, and it has a lot to do with those individual attributes of the U.S. South, the pressures that are on the U.S. South, and really our ability to focus and our ability to focus and really make a difference in critical pieces of the working forest landscape and the working forest economy. So there are some reasons why the South. Um, the other thing, though, sort of as a caveat to that, is that everything that we do, when we talk about the work that we do within Keeping Forest, we're not trying to run projects or programs in perpetuity. That's not it at all. What we're trying to do is to create the frameworks for how do you drive demand and investment in demand for and investment in working forests. And so everything that we do, even if we're doing a pilot effort, which we've done pilot efforts in South Carolina or in Alabama, we're looking at how do we scale and replicate this. So when we think about national implication, there is definitely an opportunity to take what we're learning and scale it. But right now, just with our focus, with our time, with our resources, and really with the conditions that are facing the South, we're Southern. We're Southern for now. But I'm happy to talk more about that at another time. I will send out a follow-up to this and give information for both Danan and for Tracey. I will also send out the slide deck and eventually you'll see the recording of the webinar come out. So it is 3:30. I really appreciate all of your time today. Really great participation. It's exciting to see so many people on the call. Great questions. And I look forward to working with you all in the future and have a good rest of your day and week. Take care.